country in 1945. I was here as a war correspondent when the Americans came over to accept the surrender of Jap troops. I remembered how restful the green rice paddies looked. The peaceful villages and towns like Tejong. It didn't amount to much like any small town anywhere, but it was home to these people. Still at large, its appetite for aggression unappeased. There must not be other Koreans in other lands. There will not be as long as we remain vigilant and strong. Not only these men, but all of us, the civilian, the citizen, the worker and taxpayer. The cost will not be small. Liberty is never cheap. The price we pay will be bargain insurance, however, if it prevents more of this. Let us not forget this, for our sake as well as for the rest of the world's. If we value our lives, our homes, and our freedom, let us remember the crime of Korea.
In that limbo between the war fatigue of the 1940s and the invigorated activism and counterculture of the 1960s, the Korean War happens. These events will define the international political arena for the next half-century.
On the flight deck of the Bedoying Straits,
they will redraw the political map of the globe and also change the nature of propaganda and the way war is reported.
72 planes of Marine Air Group 33, the aerial component of the 1st Provisional Brigade, which this morning, July 31st, 1950, arrived in Kobe, Japan, en route to Korea.
It brings into focus the uncomfortable reality that the largely Eurocentric control of events is now replaced by a game between superpowered giants, each determined to foist upon the international arena their own particular beliefs and values. Yet Korea is a war that is never declared by either side, and though it lasts for only 3 years, it is to shape much of the world today. This is its story.
Nets were installed and sections of the wall were blasted by high explosives. The rain and the darkness, the regiment
The demilitarized zone has 148 miles of fence along the border separating North and South Korea. But is the North ready or able to accept a dilution of its communist ethos and acknowledge the existence of an outside world that has moved on? Or, in an act of brinkmanship, will it enter an endgame that could all too easily spiral out of control? Embroiling the other powers in the region and beyond in conflict, and create the conditions for world war. Possibly even nuclear war.
Japan's coastline. And Saipan-based superforts were pounding Japan's skyline.
World War II introduced the modern world to industrial-level genocide, truly global conflict, and nuclear conflagration. British Ministry of Information newsreels of the World War II years give cinema audiences images of a sanitized war. The story they tell is strictly controlled. So when British warship HMS Barham is sunk in 1941 with a loss of 850 men, this devastating event goes unreported until 1944, when the tide is turning in favor of the Allies. In the Vietnamese War, some 40 years later, media access is changed so much that images of the North Vietnamese Tet Offensive showing American troops being attacked and injured can reach 22 million homes. This footage helps to unleash seismic movements in American political and social spheres. The United States government cannot control the public perception of Vietnam. The media war has come to America. Jack Gould writes in the New York Times in 1968, "For the huge TV audience, the grim pictures unfolded in the last week cannot fail to leave the impression that the agony of Vietnam is acute." In the same year, and in the same paper, the Hollywood view of warfare is ridiculed. When film critic Renata Adler pillories a film in which John Wayne stars, The Green Berets, she concludes that it was stupid, false, and unspeakable. Feature film now, it seems, can no longer simply help governments wage war by glorifying it. In contrast, the world's view of events in Korea turns out to be something of a watershed between the deference of the 1940s and the more liberal outlook of the Vietnam era in the 1960s. No division of a nation in the present world is so astonishing in its origin as the division of Korea. Gregory Henderson, Korea historian. With much of Europe in ruins, Hitler dead, and Japan reeling from two devastating atomic bomb attacks, the division of the Korean peninsula has some surprising origins. Like so many other divisions, it is a hasty and badly thought-out arrangement. The line on the ground is fixed by two United States Army colonels on a deadline. Germany is not the only country to be partitioned as a division of spoils by the victors. The Allies have pledged to create a unified nation, but Korea is destined to become part of a history written by the winners. It is largely agreed by the uneasy Allies that the US will control the southern half of the peninsula and the Soviet Union the northern, landward part.
Every GI was a symbol of liberation to the natives.
The two colonels are from the Strategy and Policy Group in the US War Department. They have just 30 minutes to decide on a demarcation line. Both are young, but both have remarkable futures. One of these two colonels is Charles H. Bonesteel III, who 20 years later is to command the US forces in Korea. The other is Dean Rusk, who will become the Secretary of State under Presidents John Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson. Initially, These two want to draw a line based on the borders between Korean provinces. But at such short notice, nobody can find a suitably detailed map, other than one taken out of the pages of National Geographic magazine. The colonels notice that the 38th parallel does rather neatly divide the Korean peninsula into two almost equal halves. But as a provisional and temporary demarcation, the division is made without proper attention to detail. With its geographical position between Japan and China, it is easy to see Korea as the wrong map bearing at the wrong time.
Seoul was different. It was a big town, the capital city, with 1.5 million people. I learned something about Koreans. I learned that these people, so remote from us, strange even to their fellow Asiatics, were simple human beings who wanted to live in peace and independence. They took me around their colorful 500-year-old city, showed me the buildings they were proud of, the Capitol, the Fine Arts Museum, Cheongdok Palace, Deok-su, the Chosen Bank Building. It was a city of scenes, an oriental blend of the ancient and modern. The Americans came over to accept the surrender of Jap troops below the 38th parallel.
The conflict that develops around the border is certainly not about the local territory. It is a crucible for the emerging power blocs after their grudging partnership to defeat Hitler and Japan.
We want peace, but we do not want this. We believe in freedom. Freedom, born of the conviction that every person is a child of God and is therefore of supreme worth. For these people, for ourselves, for everyone, we want freedom, not tyranny.
There is no obvious dividing line that emerges from the landscape. After the demise of the Japanese supremacy over the whole peninsula, the colonels need to create two zones of influence that the Soviet Union and the United States can accept. This temporary division has been agreed at the Potsdam Conference in Germany in July 1945, just before the atomic bombs are dropped on Japan that August. If the idea is to work towards an independent and unified Korea, this arbitrary line can only succeed in creating a distant arena. In political and military terms, the border in Korea quickly becomes a dangerous superpower fault line that will attempt to mark out the rough outlines of influence in the Far East. Following the establishment of this demarcation, which comes to be known as the 38th parallel, the two zones take shape. Korea has long been regarded as the reclusive kingdom. In its isolation, independent and united, despite invasions by the Mongols, Japanese and Manchus, it has largely been ignored for over 1,000 years. But its geographical location becomes a weakness as it finds itself wedged between the two emerging powers, Japan and Russia. In 1905, Korea becomes a Japanese protectorate following the Russo-Japanese War. 5 years later, Japan annexes the peninsula as a colony. So any jubilation at its liberation from Japan in 1945 is muted by the emergence of the internal border, the 38th parallel. In August, when Russia enters North Korea as heroic liberators, the Americans fear that the country could become a puppet communist regime. They send troops to Seoul, the nation's capital. Almost immediately, plans are laid to divide Korea. America's key man in this theater of operations is none other than the charismatic General Douglas MacArthur, a skilled tactician and audacious leader who has emerged from the long conflict with Japan. Even though an out-and-out military man, he is not a man noted for the moderation of his views concerning communism. His role in the unfolding events is to be crucial. Suddenly, with the division, there is a need for two Korean leaders. In the South, the United States backs former nationalist exile and dedicated anti-communist Syngman Rhee. In the North, Moscow supports Kim Il-sung, a former young communist who has opposed foreign rule from the start of the Japanese occupation.
Shared power. Most observers agree that there is true democracy in a community only if there is shared power. That is to say, only if many people have a share in making decisions that the community will support with force if necessary. More specifically, you can say that power is shared wherever regular popular elections are authorized and are actually held. There is shared power wherever people actually get out voluntarily and vote. And if they can vote without interference or pressure from anybody.
These primitive North Koreans, these misguided fools, their minds and emotions set ablaze by false promises and giant lies, perverted by those who would make all mankind their dupes in their lust for world control. This communist imperialism is the real criminal.
Years later, Kim Il-sung is to be the key player of the Korean War. While both men are actually aware of the important roles of their respective superpower backers, neither is prepared to act simply as a mere stooge to any creed. Syngman Rhee and Kim Il-sung are each strong and charismatic leaders, and both have their own local agendas. Their goal is, in essence, the same: a united Korea under one leader and one political system.
Soon after the end of World War II, Russia had occupied many new territories, bringing additional millions of people under communist control, and serving notice that Soviet Russia was now a world power to be reckoned with.
Initially, there seems little to separate the two regimes. South Korea is an oppressive police state, and North Korea displays equally oppressive tactics, including murder to maintain power.
The Diet, seat of Japanese government, celebrates the first hours of a nation reborn.
Partly out of a fear of a possible surge in popular communist support, the United States decides to apply the post-war Japanese model of government.
And the anniversary of Japan's post-war constitution.
Elections that are widely regarded as fairly questionable are held in Korea in 1945 and again in 1947. The newly formed United Nations supervises them. Earlier, one of the UN's first tasks has been to establish a commission on Korea. Realizing that the elections in the south are likely to mean permanent division, the Russians feel they cannot support the UN. Although the election sees Syngman Rhee voted in by a landslide, the UN supervisors have visited just 2% of the polling stations before declaring the election properly democratic.
We would all agree that democracy includes government. Let's see if we can, each one of us, sharpen of democracy. We know that democratic words and forms have been written into laws. But it is the way people practice democracy that really counts. Let's ask this man about defining democracy. He studies communities and the way people live in them. He goes about his job scientifically, observing, recording, analyzing, and reporting.
Well, I'll tell you one thing. Students of society have been reporting their observations and analyses for a good many centuries. And as yet, there is not one single definition of democracy that they would all accept. There is one point, however, they would all agree on, and this is it. In thinking seriously of democracy, one must define his words carefully and use them consistently. When you have your own definitions clear, you know exactly what to look for in a community.
The result is suspicion. Police patrol the polls in order to keep away dangerous factions such as student groups. Nevertheless, General MacArthur, who has ruled post-war Japan in the style of a regent, flies into South Korea to congratulate Rhee and celebrate the zone's independence. Now, the Soviet authorities in the north, not to be outdone, follow suit with elections of their own. The legitimacy and consolidation of Kim Il-sung is assured in equally contentious circumstances. By 1948, then, following the elections, we are faced with two opposing systems of government, both claiming sovereignty over the whole peninsula. They are the Republic of Korea in the south and the Democratic People's Republic of Korea in the north. Kim Il-sung asks the Soviet forces to withdraw from the north, though leaving behind some 250 military advisors. In June 1949, the United States, seeking to reduce their support of Korea, partly to cut back their overseas financial commitments, also withdraw from the south. They too leave behind military advisors, twice as many as the Russians in the north. The country is now well and truly divided. But both leaders, left to their own devices, harbor their aims of Korean unification. Recently obtainable security documents from Russia clearly show that Kim Il-sung is the main instigator of the war, though it is probable that Rhee would have acted in a similar manner, given the opportunity. The tide in the region seems to be running the East's way.
Mao Zedong's self-proclaimed War of National Liberation is a series of battles of annihilation, with talk of a coalition government, a united front, a new democracy. But Mao's promises of popular representation only mask the communist leader's real intentions. Finally, all of mainland China is swallowed up by the so-called liberation movement,
and 1/4 of the world's population is brought under communist control.
When the communist Mao Zedong takes power in mainland China in 1949, Kim Il-sung senses his opportunity. He now releases to his allies, in both Moscow and increasingly Beijing, a series of half-truths and half-promises. In Moscow, Soviet leader Joseph Stalin, buoyed by the revolution in China, feels anything is possible. Kim Il-sung's hints are now that the United States would not get involved to protect South Korea should an invasion from the north materialize. The new evidence indicates that by early 1950, a conspiracy of allies is beginning to unfold between the North Korean leader, Stalin, and the Chinese leader, Mao Zedong. A consensus forms that an invasion across the 38th parallel is desirable to enable unification. At the 1945 Yalta Conference, Soviet leader Stalin is concerned to create a buffer zone around his country to stop future invasions. To the west, however, this is expansionism in a Europe. Churchill and Roosevelt feel the need for a North Atlantic alliance to block it. This leads, in 1949, to NATO being formed.
On behalf of the government and the people of the United States, I welcome warmly to our country and our capital the foreign ministers who have assembled here to sign the North Atlantic Treaty.
In 1946, senior American diplomat in Moscow, George Kennan, writes a message to Washington that comes to be called the Long Telegram. He sends his analysis of the view from Moscow to the State Department, stressing that the Soviet Union's intentions towards the West are without doubt hostile. The Kremlin, Kennan insists, will yield only to superior force. He advocates a policy of containment of Soviet influence, a term always associated with him. It has a disturbing impact on the US administration. In a speech to Congress in March 1947, President Truman advocates aid to Turkey and Greece in order to repel covert communist advances. But he concludes by saying, "It must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressure." The policy that comes to be known as the Truman Doctrine.
Country by country, continent by continent, world revolution follows Mao Zedong's classic conquest of China, dividing the world as a nation is divided into cities and rural areas. In this Red Chinese battle plan, North America and Western Europe are the cities of the world, and Asia, Africa, Central America, and South America, the rural areas. With revolution organized everywhere, there will be a tide of opposition to the free world. And the imperialists will be swept from the stage of history. The communists are waging a guerrilla war patterned after Mao Zedong's War of National Liberation.
The concern over Moscow's intentions has been aggravated in March 1946 when the ex-Prime Minister of Great Britain, Winston Churchill, visits the US. Truman and his Secretary of State, Dean Acheson, hold him in great respect, so they heartily approve of a speech he makes at Fulton, Missouri. Churchill rails against the danger he sees from communism.
I will venture to be precise. A shadow had fallen upon the scenes so lately lighted by the Allied victory.
From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. According to Churchill and the rising anti-Soviet chorus, the very notion of Christian civilization is at stake.
The might of a free people had come at last to triumph over the lords of war.
The NATO treaty has shown that force would be used in Europe to repel any Soviet push. The carrot for potential wavering countries is $400 million of Marshall Plan money. But the United States also carries a big stick to prove its power to the Soviet Union. Would the same really apply to Southeast Asia? Unlike in Western and Southern Europe, the United States seems unwilling to countenance a military response to northern aggression in Korea. This confusion in American policy on Korea is coming from the Washington administration itself. Acheson expresses reluctance to confront North Korean belligerence in a speech to the National Press Club. He says that American foreign policy does not include protecting by force the independence of South Korea. The countries Acheson would protect by military means run the Pacific Rim between Japan and the Philippine Islands. The remnants of a non-communist China on the island of Formosa, now Taiwan, and South Korea are frankly outside this zone. Acheson says, quite bluntly, Korea is not of decisive strategic importance. Budgetary concerns are also influencing U.S. thinking. Commitments are already stretched.
Thus does militant communist China and Mao Zedong see the day when Peking becomes the ideological center of a world enslaved.
Further evidence of a secret plan for a communist invasion of the South unfolds with the build-up of North Korean forces during the winter of 1949. Mainland China is proclaimed the People's Republic of China on the 1st of October, 1949. It begins to send troops to the Yalu River on China's border, where the Korean peninsula meets Asia proper.
Immediately after his visit to Moscow, military arms and equipment began to arrive in North Korea.
Russia, meanwhile, is delivering its famed T-34 tanks, Yak fighters, and other military equipment to the North Korean army. Mao is also moving away from any Western attempts at establishing cordial relations with his regime. After his visit to Moscow in December 1949, he rejects all calls from within his own circle to engage with the West. Instead, he gravitates towards the Soviet Union. Despite receiving a cool reception from a still wary Stalin and the leader's mutual suspicion, the Chinese leader successfully negotiates a pact of friendship and support with Stalin. This Chinese-Soviet treaty, designed to protect their countries from a revitalized Japan, obliges each to come to the aid of the other in the event of an attack from a third party.
United with Russia in war, we strove to preserve that unity and peace. We helped organize the United Nations, in which the nations of the world have mutually pledged to cooperate in fostering world peace and progress. Andrei Gromyko signed for Russia. But in the first post-war Italian elections, the communists created disorder in an attempt to gain control of the government. Once more, the world was reminded that basic in the idea of communism is the plan of world revolution, and that Russian communism has stepped beyond that plan to achieve world domination through aggression.
On January the 30th, 1950, Stalin sends a message to Kim Il-sung offering Soviet support for what he calls his unification project. His army strikes across the 38th parallel on the 25th of June, 1950. With nearly 100,000 troops, armed with some 1,400 military pieces and 126 tanks. The prominent role of Soviet military advisors within the upper reaches of North Korea's high command now makes it inconceivable that the endeavor was not in some way sanctioned by Moscow. The attack is a complete surprise, catching both the South Koreans and the Americans off guard. The Southern Army, having failed to place anti-tank lines, find themselves on the retreat against this blitzkrieg of superior forces. By June the 28th, the North Korean forces even managed to capture the old capital, Seoul. The Korean War begins. The first and only direct military conflict that would go on to involve the superpowers. It also ensures that the theatre of confrontation between capitalist and communist ideologies being played out in Europe is now to extend to Asia. The wholly unexpected invasion reveals a new and highly dangerous escalation of the Cold War.
In China, the communists have established their own puppet government. In Korea, communist aggression has come into actual combat with forces of the United Nations. And with the most deadly of all weapons available to the Russians, no peoples in the world can feel secure against this aggression.
It was the Korean War, and not World War II, that made the United States a world military political power. Charles Bolan, diplomat. Following the North Korean attack, a special United Nations meeting is urgently convened. The Russians have boycotted the UN because communist China has not yet been allocated a seat in place of nationalist China. A motion calling for the North Korean forces to withdraw above the 38th parallel is still tabled. At a second meeting, a United States resolution is accepted that allows the UN General Assembly to recommend measures, including the use of force, to counter a threat to peace if the Security Council was unable to act. With the Russians still absent and unable to use their veto, effectively paralyzing the Council since 1945, a further resolution is passed which states that the members of the United Nations furnish such assistance to the Republic of Korea as may be necessary to repel the armed attack. With this call to action now in place, the United Nations begins to assemble a US-led coalition to turn back the invaders. In reality, the United States has already decided to act unilaterally, if need be. Harry Truman, using his executive powers, reacts to the North's aggression by giving immediate assistance to the Republic of Korea. American air and sea support is dispatched in an attempt to stem the North Korean advance and strengthen the defense in the south. No official declaration of war is made. With foresight about its future role in the world, the United States instead calls its response to the crisis a police action. The Americans are going to be vigorous in their response to North Korean aggression. They want action. Truman now stresses that the United States is prepared to intervene in Korea to stop the communist tide. This time, Dean Acheson outlines a new policy. It is now clear to all, if indeed it was not before, that free nations must be united. They must be determined, and they must be strong if they are to preserve their freedom and maintain a righteous peace. There is no other way. Less than a year after they left the peninsula, the Americans are going back. The decision to send aid to the Republic of Korea is described by President Truman in his memoirs as the toughest decision he ever made in his presidency. The situation on the ground is now critical. Korea is being overrun. Eventually, 15 UN member nations agree to send troops to Korea to form the coalition, although this force relies overwhelmingly on the United States as the basis of resistance to the communist armies.
Korea in 1950, Communist China and the free world come into conflict when South Korea is invaded by Communist forces from North Korea. The United Nations Security Council is convened in emergency session in New York, and the members vote to send troops into combat to help defend the independence and sovereignty of South Korea.
The fact that communist forces have invaded Korea is a warning that there may be similar acts of aggression in other parts of the world. Free nations must be on their guard more than ever before against this type of sneak attack. Aggression must be met firmly. Appeasement leads only to further aggression and ultimately to war. This quote from Truman strongly suggests that he is coming round to the view that the previous policy of containment only may not be enough. The United States cannot simply stall the Soviet communist threat. Later, in his State of the Union address in January 1951, he calls for an expansion of the American Air Force to 95 groups, doubling its strength with far more formidable equipment. Arrangements are also made to strengthen the structure of overseas bases to further enhance and extend America's military reach. At this time, all areas of the US forces are being greatly increased. Mothballed armaments are quickly being recommissioned. the very real potential for the Korean War to develop into all-out war with the Soviet Union also fosters lobbying of the president to concentrate resources and speed up the hydrogen bomb program. The production of atomic weapons is stepped up. The National Security Council proposes a threefold increase in the American rearmament of nuclear and conventional forces. The United States is considering advocating a policy of maintaining supremacy. Acheson sums up this approach when he says, "What we must do is create situations of strength. With that change, there comes a difference in the negotiating position of the various parties, and out of that, I should hope that there would be a willingness on the side of the Kremlin to recognize the facts." It is highly unlikely that these new American policies, especially those pushing atomic and hydrogen weapons, would take place without the Korean War. Those in the government advocating increased military spending have the best line to win the argument. This would elevate America into the major military political power and essentially to become the world's policeman.
How are we meeting this challenge? Yes, one way is by helping the free world fight starvation and poverty and suffering, conditions that pave the way for communist infiltration. We are also supplying equipment for the free nations to develop their own resources and raise their living standards. Another way we are meeting the challenge is by military alliance with some of the other free nations for mutual aid in opposing direct communist aggression. And we are building up our own military defense. But do these preparations mean that we have abandoned hope for peace?
America's commitment to confront communism anywhere in the world has its roots in the Korean War. What are the options now that Seoul has fallen? The nearest United States forces, 4 divisions based in Japan, are sent by President Truman within a week of the invasion. MacArthur, the supreme commander for the Allies in Japan, is ordered to dispatch them to the aid of the South Koreans. July the 1st, the 500 troops are given orders to drive up the peninsula as far as possible, engage the enemy, and slow down their advance. They land at Busan on the South Peninsula and proceed north to join the South's armies fighting near the town of Asan. However, they are poorly prepared, scarcely ready or trained, many with no idea what the emergency is about. They are soon to be completely overwhelmed. Seeing the enemy, the American contingent, which comes to be known as Task Force Smith, can only dig in. They have little chance, however, of stopping